What is up, my dude and dudettes, and welcome back to TellerTube. In today's video, we're going to be looking at the subreddit r/Prorevenge. If you guys are new to my channel, be sure to subscribe so you can stay up to date with my latest videos. And with that being said, sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. How I got our translator fired. Okay, so I was working a job that had me operating in one of our offices overseas. We would have business expenses, and those receipts would be in the language of the country we were in, obviously. Those expenses were things like printer ink, office equipment, cleaning services, marketing costs, all pretty standard stuff. Well, around this time, we got a new VP over our region who worked out of head office in LA. This VP came up with this brilliant idea to hire a translator to translate all of our receipts to make sure we weren't sneaking in nonsense. Fair enough. However, the issue that arose was that we had to send our expenses to the translator who would translate the receipt then submit for reimbursement. The problem was this translator was a real Karen type. She would demand better scans of the receipts oftentimes after we had already thrown it away. She would argue if we really got the best deal on whatever we bought. I remember in one transaction on about $200 of ink cartridges, she asked me why I didn't order online from the common website. To which I said they were out of stock at the time and we needed the ink, so we bought from a local store. To which she said I was spending too much money. To which I said it's none of your concern, your job is to translate the receipt. To which she said if I wanted her to submit my expenses, I need to be nice to her. To which I said she needs to learn her place. She's a translator, not a VP that gets to instruct me what to do. After this encounter, she started being extra anal with my expenses. So one day, I came in the office early to call her and try to work things out. She basically told me that I screwed up by pissing her off, and she expected my expense reports to be perfect or she wouldn't submit them unless they were. I told her if she keeps this up, she won't have a job much longer. She laughed and wished me well and hung up. A few months later, we had our annual meeting in LA, and after the meeting, we were at a bar and I walked up to our VP and started up a conversation. I steered the conversation to expenses and asked how much in monthly expenses did he typically reimburse us for in the country we worked out of. He said about $3,000 to $4,000. I acted surprised and asked, is that all? And he goes, yeah. To clarify, that $3,000 to $4,000 is the typical spend. And he says, yeah, it rarely gets above $4,000. So I ask him about how Karen, our translator, is doing, and he says she's doing a good job, and I nod my head and I go, how much fraudulent expenses has she caught? It's important to note, every employee that was submitting expenses was well paid. They'd be awfully stupid trying to skim some extra dollars via fraudulent expenses reports. He goes, what do you mean? I said, well, you hired her to ensure all the expenses you were reimbursing us for are legitimate, right? Her job is to translate them for you, correct? He says it is, and I ask, so is it safe to presume that you've done that to ensure people aren't submitting BS expenses? He says, you could say that. I smile and ask, so how much in fraudulent expenses has she caught? He thinks for a moment and goes, I don't think she's caught any. So I ask, and how much do we pay her? He says it depends on her workload, but between $2,500 and $3,000 a month. I smile and ask, does it make sense to pay someone $3,000 a month to translate $3,000 in receipts? Well, she ensures we aren't getting fraudulent expenses, and I counter, well, you said she hasn't counted any in the last 9 months, and the expenses are always between $3,000 and $4,000. So as long as the expenses stay in that range, wouldn't it be safe to assume that the expenses are legitimate? And couldn't you bring on a translator on a contract basis if they get out of hand? He sees my point. And imagine the cost savings. We would probably save over $40,000 a year. That's a good chunk of change, isn't it? The VP tries to defend his position, but she does a good job. But you could frame this as you've saved us $40,000 a year and created a baseline to judge expenses by. Cutting costs is always good for the bottom line and the end of year bonuses, isn't it? FYI, I knew that a major percent of the VP comp packages with the company had to do with the company's margin at the end of the year. The bigger the margin, the bigger the bonus. You can see the twinkle in his eye. We carry on the rest of the night. A few weeks later, we get an email from the VP saying that we are to submit all our expenses directly to admin for reimbursement and that we have let go of Karen. FYI, Karen wasn't her real name, obviously. Okay, that's pretty savage. But I mean, Karen, if you want to play the hard game, you're gonna get the hard game. How my grandpa became the owner of a gas station / garage. So my family immigrated to America in the 1980s and settled in Nebraska. We were farmers for the first 80 years or so, but back in the 1960s, my great-grandma decided she was going to sell the entire farm before she died and simply give her sons a third of the money for inheritance when she passed. She had 3 sons. In 1969, my great-grandma passed and her 3 sons inherited the money she had earned from selling the farm. My grandpa decided he would basically let that money sit until after he retired from the military. In 1971, he deployed to Vietnam for his second and final deployment. At the end of his deployment, he returned to Nebraska and retired after 22 years in the service. Now, he had an old Chevy truck at the time and was in the process of building a concrete business with the money he had gotten from his inheritance. Well, during this time, his truck engine blew up. My grandpa was so busy at the time, he didn't want to fool around with the truck because he was busy. So he bought himself the engine he wanted to replace it with, which was an upgrade, and he went down to the only garage in town and asked them if they'd be willing to put the engine in the truck. They agreed on the price and told him to come back in a week or so. A week later, my grandpa comes back and picks up the truck. He admits he felt like a fool for not double checking the work, but assumed since this was the son of his friend that the son would do right by him. This was a small town. Well, my grandpa opens up the concrete business and he's busy, and it comes time for his first oil change. This is about 4 months after he got the truck back. He's doing the oil change and he notices the engine he bought isn't the engine in his truck. It's a smaller engine. This obviously pisses him off to high heaven, as my grandma liked to say. So he storms on down to the garage and talks to the shop. Earl was the owner. Earl comes out and denies any wrongdoing. Says he did as he was told and it shouldn't have taken him 4 months to bring the issue up. My grandpa tells Earl he needs to do what's right. Earl refuses. It's important to note this is a small town. Written contracts and so forth really isn't a thing. You're worthy of your word. My grandpa tells Earl he's going to get him for this. Earl laughs and tells him to leave his shop. My grandpa goes down to the county and requests the records for who owns the gas station. Turns out it's an old family friend named Harold. My grandpa stops by Harold's house and starts inquiring about the business deal Harold has with Earl. Harold says, well, Earl rents the gas station / garage from him. My grandpa asks Harold how everything is going, and Harold confides that Earl hasn't paid his rent in 2 months. My grandpa asks, do you have a written lease with Earl? To which Harold goes, nah, I sure don't. My grandpa then asks, what if I bought the gas station / garage from you? Harold isn't completely on board with the idea, but my grandpa makes a strong point. Earl isn't paying his rent, Harold doesn't seem like he has much interest in being a landlord anymore, and my grandpa has the cash to buy the place outright. Harold, sensing something is up, asks my grandpa, did Earl do something to you? You seem awfully interested in this garage. Ain't you busy with that concrete business of yours? And my grandpa fills Harold in on the story. My grandpa also mentions that he has a son, my father, who needs something to do. And he'd be happy to buy the whole building from Harold for a fair price, and what happens after that is his business. Also, it's important to note when Harold decided to rent this business to Earl, in that deal went all the equipment and tools that Harold had acquired over the years, so those belong to the building. Harold and my grandpa came to a number that they both agreed on. A few days later, my grandpa paid Harold in cash, in full for the business. The paperwork is done and my grandpa is now the proud owner of the gas station and mechanic shop. Now, my grandpa senses that Earl isn't going to be pleased when my grandpa fires Earl, so for extra good measure, my grandpa calls up the local sheriff, who is a high school friend, and asks the sheriff to come with him to break the news to Earl. So my grandpa and the sheriff go down to Earl's now former business, and they walk in, and before my grandpa can even say hello, Earl says, "Now I told you I didn't cheat you." My grandpa smiles and says, "I'm not here about my truck, I'm here to fire you." Earl, with a look of confusion on his face, asks, "You can't fire me, I own this business." My grandpa shows him the title and says, "I'm now the owner of this building." To which Earl fires back, "But I gotta deal with Harold." And the sheriff speaks up, "You do? Do you have a lease?" "Well, no," Earl says. To which the sheriff smiles and says, "In that case, you're going to need to take your stuff and leave." Earl is fuming pissed, grabs his toolbox and storms out. My grandpa ended up hiring the mechanic that would occasionally work on his truck at his concrete business. He had my aunt and grandma run the gas station full time, and my dad would work there after school. We owned that garage for 25 years before my grandpa sold it to someone else. Yeah, now that's some revenge. So you want to steal my engine and act like you didn't do it. We'll see how that works out for you, Chief. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. If you did, smash that like button as it would really help me out. Subscribe to the channel so you can stay up to date with my latest videos, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.